I didn't hear it. I call the member for Braddon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this important issue because in my electorate, local charities are the fabric of the local communities, and in every town those charities are supported almost always by volunteers, and they are there to support the disadvantaged and the vulnerable people in my communities who are doing it tough. But what is very clear is this government is continuing to undermine the very work of these very decent, hard-working volunteers as they go about doing this work in these communities. They already undermine these people to such an extent that local charities are too afraid to speak out on issues of importance. I know from conversations with many local groups they are too afraid to speak out because they are worried that their funding will be cut. This is the climate of fear that they currently operate in. Thank you very much to the government sitting opposite. But now this government wants to go even further and stifle their voice and tie them up in bureaucratic knots. It is some sort of warped priority that this government could claim to be the advocates for free speech, when at the same time they make it harder for charitable groups to express a public view. How is it then that this government says it's all right for someone to be a bigot, but it's not all right for a charity to call for increased funding to tackle homelessness? Once again, we see evidence that this Prime Minister continues to lurch to the far right and become captive of the ideologues in the coalition. But then again, when it comes to supporting our charities, this government has a track record that by any reasonable measure it could not be proud of. For 6 years, the coalition had a policy to abolish the Australian Charities and Non-Profit Commission. The government already forces social services charities to sign gag clauses to prevent them from speaking out on policy issues. Since being elected, there have been multiple ministers responsible for charities, with even one minister refusing to meet with the Charities Commission head. And to top it off, before the end of last year, this government appointed a person who is opposed to the work of charities as the head of the Australian Charities and Non-for-Profits Commission. Gary Johns might be a nice man, I've never met him, but from what he has said about charities, he could not possibly be the right person for the job. Any person that attacks the work of Beyond Blue supporting vulnerable young LGBTQI people is clearly unfit for the role. But it is very clear that those opposites have not spoken to, engaged with in any positive way with charities. Just 7 days ago, Pro Bono released a survey and found that many charities are unclear and concerned about how they stand to be affected by the government's electoral funding and disclosure reform bill. And in fact, 96% of those respondents had not even been consulted by the government on this bill. Last year, I had the great pleasure to participate in the Vinnie's CEO Sleep Out. It's a national program. I hope everyone has that opportunity to do so. And this campaign is to raise awareness of homelessness and the reasons why people find themselves in this situation. Can someone from the other side seriously explain why this charity should be stifled and tied up in knots through a political disclosure regime? Why should they feel threatened to not speak out for the need for extra funding to address homelessness? I do agree that front groups for political parties should have a higher degree of scrutiny. In my state of Tasmania, in the middle of a state election, big business and vested interstate interest groups are openly funding a third-party campaign against the opposition party. These types of activities certainly need proper scrutiny and a more timely reporting mechanism. The community should also be given the opportunity to know who is behind the campaigns and how much is being contributed. The community should have the right to know who the puppet master is pulling the Tasmanian Liberal Premier's strings. But that does not mean charities such as Beyond Blue, Anglicare, St Vincent de Paul and many others should be caught up. The government needs to go back to the drawing board and redraft their legislation, and maybe even go and talk to these charities. You could actually learn something for a change. Then maybe those on the other side of this House, we could all have a sensible conversation.